Hello, good evening and welcome to The Probe. I am Carlos Caloni. We are live on DSTV channel 421, GoTV channel 125. We're also live on Joy 99.7 FM and Love 99.5 FM. And you can also catch us live streaming across all our digital platforms, Facebook, YouTube and X at JoyNews on TV and globally via myjoyonline.com. It's just 2 days to go until world leaders descend on New York for the 80th United Nations High-Level General Assembly, what they call the debate. President John Dramani Mahama will join fellow heads of state for one of the biggest global conversations of the year. But this milestone of the UN is more than just ceremonial. While some hail the UN for its 8 decades of peace-building efforts, others argue that the organization has struggled to live up to its founding mission of securing global peace and stability. Well, as the world faces fresh waves of conflict, climate crisis, as you know, inequality and shifting geopolitics, the question looms larger than before. Is the UN still relevant in today's world? That's the big question we're asking tonight. This evening, we unpack that debate from Africa's stake in the global system to whether the UN's objectives need rewriting for our times. But even before that, here are some highlights of what the UN has been doing for the past 80 years. It will be there on your screen shortly, where we'll look at since it was established up to this point. Now, the United Nations at a glance, you see the core objectives of the UN. It was founded in 1945 after the Second World War. That's the history. Now, here are some of its core objectives. One is to maintain peace and security. It's also to foster friendly relations among nations, promote human rights, support development and cooperation. Now, let's look at UN's contribution to global peace since it was established. Over 70 peacekeeping missions since 1948. And it's also doing what it's called the mediation and diplomacy through Security Council and special envoys. Then also it's involved in humanitarian aid through its agencies like the WFP, the UNICEF, UNHCR in war zones. Now, since 1975 to 2024, let's look at the conflict around the world. There have been about 61 conflicts around the world since then, and some are still active as we speak. You see, these 61 active armed conflicts worldwide, 11 have been classified as wars. That's from between 1975 to 2024. Those that are active now, Russia-Ukraine war, I believe you're following that keenly, and Iran-Israel, which has ended, but the tensions still exist. And when it comes to Togo, we know there are some conflicts there, civil conflict in that country as well as in Kenya. These are very active as we speak now. Now, let's look at Africa and the United Nations. Now, Africa hosts 9 out of 11 active UN peacekeeping missions. That's significant, 9 out of 11. And Rwanda, Ethiopia, and Ghana are the very top of troop contributions to peacekeeping missions. Now, the UN Support Agenda 2063 and SDGs to aid development. You know, those are the things with Africa and the United Nations. Now, Ghana and the United Nations, this is a significant number you see there on your screen. Personnel deployment in UN peacekeeping. This figure is as at 2023. Ghana has contributed 2,756, peacekeeping personnel, to support UN missions. And Ghana and the United Nations, when it comes to the UN agencies and contributions, we know we have the UNDP. It's contributed to the job, governance, and climate resilience. UNICEF also is there, child health and education. We've seen a lot of what they are doing in Ghana. WHO is also there, outbreak responses and vaccination when diseases do happen here in the country. Well, so those are the very things that the UN has been doing across the world, on the African continent, as well as here in our country, Ghana. Well, joining us via Zoom is a former UN Senior Governance Advisor, Professor Bafo Ajimandua, Also on Zoom is a dialogue and mediation practitioner, Emmanuel Bombardier, who also served as Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and a senior mediation advisor at the UN DPPA, as well as Dr. Ishmael Kwabla-Holovo. He is an international relations expert. Together, they will help us assess whether the UN has actually delivered on its promise and whether or not the UN is still relevant today. Stay tuned in. Welcome back, and thank you so much for staying with us. Let's begin with Professor Baffour Agyeman-Duah. You have been at the UN, you have advised the UN for so many years. The United Nations is celebrating its 80th anniversary. The question is, are there any reasons to even celebrate? Prof, if you can unmute, I believe we'll be able to hear what you're saying. Well, we are trying to reconnect that line to Professor Baffour Agyeman-Duah, who was a senior governance advisor to the United Nations. Let me try and see if I have Emmanuel Bombardier on the other line. If you are with us, do we have reasons to celebrate the UN at 80?
Good evening, Carlos, and good evening to all the viewers and listeners of this important program. My response is absolutely. Absolutely, we have very good reason to continue to celebrate the relevance of the UN. You gave a summary before we came on air, and the UN remains the only global forum for international cooperation, for developing collective responses to the challenges that confront our humanity. And we often say, for those of us who have worked with the UN, that we are strongest in our humanity when we are one and when we stand together. And despite the challenges and the storms that have hit the UN cannot be replaced, because it is not about the power of a country that makes it to be able to determine how this world must move forward. It is about the collective, including the smallest of our nation states to the most powerful of our nation states. And I say this briefly to suggest this. There are issues that it's not about might that can resolve it. If you take the challenges of the environment, specifically in climate change, everybody's effort is required for us to be able to deal with it for the security, for the climate security of all our people. And you need the smallest of our countries and the biggest of our countries to work collectively to do that.
Well, I'll come to you. You said the UN cannot be replaced. And from where you see it, you believe the UN is doing well. Some have actually raised concerns about the fairness of the UN itself in a lot of issues, which I believe you know. Issue of recognizing Palestine as a state, and the fact that, as we speak, Africa does not have a permanent seat on the Security Council, among others. We'll come to those issues. But first of all, let me go to Professor Baffour Agyeman-Duah to find out what he makes of the 80th anniversary of the United Nations. Good reasons?
Well, thank you. Certainly, 80 years of the UN has been good for the world. But I think for us to appreciate the effectiveness of the UN, we have to look at it in two ways. One side is where my very good friend Bombardier has just said. If you look at the collective, where all of us are represented at the General Assembly, and then you look at those UN agencies that are doing groundwork across the world. Like when there's conflict somewhere, like in Liberia, they mobilize troops to go and fight on behalf of the UN to maintain peace. The UNDP, or Council of Development Program. That's one side of the UN that we have to appreciate. But the other side is where your question really hit hard. The other side is the prime reason why the United Nations was formed back in 1945. After the Second World War, the world decided that no more should we have such a catastrophic war in the world. So they formed the Security Council.
Right.
And I think in retrospect, the biggest mistake was to have given veto powers to those 5 leading nations at the time. Perhaps if they didn't give the veto powers to them, maybe the UN would not have been formed. But that's what the problem is. You see, because the veto power enables one country to veto any decision that all the collective has made. So you spoke about Palestine. About 6-7 times, one country, the United States, has vetoed. The last one, a few days ago, where the 15-member council, 14 said, yes, we should have the resolution. The United States vetoed it. Meaning that the whole world is subject to the United States taking us hostage for an issue where the world seems to agree. That, for me, is the weakest point of the United Nations. And I don't know how we overcome that. Maybe in the course of the conversation, I can say more about that.
Right. Let me bring in Dr. Ishmael Lovo. He is also an international relations expert, and I believe that he would have a lot to say when it comes to the UN's existence for the past 80 years. Prof and Emmanuel Bombade have given us reasons that, well, of course, the UN may not be perfect, but they've achieved a lot. You share their view?
Definitely. It's not a perfect organization. It's not a perfect institution. And of course, nobody set out to have a perfect institution. You always have institutions with their own limitations. But the most important question is that, are they having an impact that keep humanity together? Then in respect to that, you will say, yes, they have done so well within the last 80 years in so many spheres of life, be it human rights, be it environment, be it economic, be it, they have done well. We may have the challenges we are having, but still we need the UN. We need to strengthen it instead of disbanding it. We need to make sure that it becomes more effective. So for the past 80 years, of course, nobody can argue that the US has been a very useful forum for addressing humanity's common challenges. Even in instances where we have conflict that occasionally involve major powers, the UN still provide a forum where they engage in discussions. It may not bring an end to the conflict, but even in managing those conflicts, in trying to ensure that those who are the worst affected have some relief, the UN still is at the forefront of it. We may have our views in terms of the challenges that it is facing, but it still remains a very useful institution within the framework of global governance, within the framework of trying to get nations to act collectively. It still remains the most potent institution we have, irrespective of the challenges it is facing.
Right. Hold it for me. Let me go to Emmanuel Bombade. Just like Prof said, it appears the United States appears to be holding the whole world to ransom. I mean, with a veto power, one country is able to change the course of the global decision. And he believes this is the weakest link of the United Nations. How do we change that? First of all, what is your view on the veto power arrangement? And what would you propose in solving that challenge?
So let me appreciate Professor Bafo and my colleague Ishmael's compliment of the conversation as it goes on. Let me start by saying, if you listen attentively, and I'm here referring to your viewers and listeners, to what Professor said and Ishmael said, it is the imperfection of the United Nations is stemming from the very members of the United Nations, particularly the permanent members of the Security Council, refusing to respect the very principles upon which the United Nations was founded. So that you begin to see a United Nations that should have worked for our humanity. But the assumption was that member states would then translate the values and the principles that set up the United Nations so that it is then effective for all of us. But those assumptions were wrong. And that's what Prof, in my view, was underscoring. That our assumption that the powerful nations of the world would then see the reason for safeguarding this world and our humanity And keep in mind, if you look at this, the Charter of the United Nations, it talks about our generations yet to come. But we have now seen today that if we have a complex global security landscape, it is not because of the overwhelming majority of all of us who belong to the United Nations. Interestingly, it is the 5 permanent members who have created this complex global insecurity. And then very briefly now to the main question. The reform of the Security Council is absolutely important and urgent, as if it should have been done yesterday. But that's one of the reasons for the imperfection. Because how can the United Nations exclude the overwhelming majority of its member states when it comes to the very important decision making? And you ask, how do we resolve this? In Africa, we have a very clear, you see, the good thing that many people refuse to acknowledge is that despite our challenges, the African continent continues to lead in how we build consensus. So when people were saying that, how do you reform the Security Council? And if you want more countries to be part of, if we go to Africa, who do we choose? We met and then we agreed on the Israel-Winnie consensus on the reform of the Security Council. And we then went further to outline how we in Africa would agree on the 2 members that should come from Africa. And then we did outline parameters in which regular consultations between us and those 2 member states with our own Africa Peace and Security Council would carry the voices of the rest of Africa. That now has translated to inform how other continents also begin to build consensus so that it is no longer what we can do for the representation, but it is the political will to make the decision and open up the Security Council for reforms and for that representation. And I end on this note. Who are the people who should allow that? The permanent 5, the Security Council. And they are the ones who continue to block it and to block it. But we must persist, we must continue, and we must continue to speak louder and louder for these reforms.
Yeah, but before I move on to other speakers, some have also argued that the permanent 5, they were originally set up to work against World War, post-World War II. So, of course, they are just doing their work. And Africa and the other continent were not in that equation of a sort. And so that justifies what their continuous stay in that, Security Council table, around that table. Is it a solid argument?
It is not. And my reason is very simple. In 2023, whilst I was still a senior mediation advisor on DPPA, the Secretary General issued a report that we call a new agenda for peace. In that new agenda for peace, there was a recognition that the world was in transition. So what the United Nations did not succeed in doing is to carry itself along into the transition of the new world. And what do I mean by that? We joined the United Nations soon after our independence, but we were not there at the founding. And keep in mind, we are the first sub-Saharan Africa to have gained independence. So you are saying that the entire sub-Saharan continent of Africa was not present when the UN was being formed. And so too with many countries around the world. And so we needed to transit into a new UN Security Council, taking into account that the world had shifted and that we now had many more members that became member states of the United Nations. And that is the refusal. And so for me, the Security Council Permanent 5 refused to look at this transition and the overall interest of inclusion and equity precisely because it interests them at their national level. Because most of the countries were still colonial dependent states. And because we were still colonial dependent states, even after independence, some of the member states of the P5 wanted dependency to continue. And as we speak, Africa cannot raise any issue on the agenda of the Security Council without going through a pen holder. And for the Francophone countries, the pen holder is France.
Right.
And for the Anglophone countries, the pen holder could be the United Kingdom or the United States. So the UN in itself represents injustice. And that is the imperfection we are talking about.
Right. Let me bring in Professor Bafo Ajimambia. You agree that African countries do not have the capacity to sit at that table?
Oh, I think we do have the capacity. It's just that we have not been given that opportunity to sit there. We are more than capable. We have the capacity. But I think the issue is what my good friend Bombande has just recounted. You see, this issue, even in my graduate school days, this was a debate. How do you restructure it? The 5 permanent members with the veto powers written in the UN Charter, all of them will have to agree for a change to occur in the structure of the United Nations. And as he said, because of their self-interest in the current structure, you do not expect all of them to agree. Even if you say, look, Ghana is misbehaving, let's kick Ghana out, right? All the 5 veto-wielding members will have to say yes. If one says no, that decision cannot be made. It's built into the structure. So you see, when we talk about reforming it and Africa having two seats and all, I think countries like the UN, US in particular, will be laughing. These guys have structured this together with the subsequent international financial structures to ensure that Ghana and so-called underdeveloped countries, African countries, that they keep us where we are.
And that brings, not to cut you, that brings to mind the trade wars we are experiencing now, where the United States, WTO has its regulations, what should be done. But the U.S., for instance, can't just take a solo decision that affects other nations.
Damn right. And what this tells us is that leadership of the 5 permanent members is critical to ensuring the equity that my good friend Emmanuel just said. If a country happens to have a leader whose ideas and views of the world run haywire, if I should put it that way, or who believes in the supremacy of his country, then we are not going to have our way. That's a tragedy. Right. So if you ask me, how do we do it? Bambade did a good job telling us how the African countries have decided to get their 2 reps. But it depends on the unanimity of votes of the 5 permanent countries. And as we sit here, I have no hope that can occur in my lifetime.
Well, it's sad anyway. But let me come to Ishmael Lovo on the issue of, fairness when it comes to, Africa having a permanent representation at that table. Emmanuel Bombade has, spoken about what needs to be done, as well as Professor Bafo Ajimambia. From where you sit, what is your proposal on the way to resolve this particular challenge?
So, okay, thank you. You see, the Security Council itself was established at a point to reflect a certain power balance. That is, that you are trying to balance the demands of those major powers that fought the war and won the war. Now, but over the past 80 years, that dynamic has shifted. So if you are looking at those 5 countries as very powerful, even in terms of relative power, in terms of absolute power, their power is no longer the same as it used to be at the time of formation of the UN. So you now have more other countries like India, like Brazil, who are making more contribution to the global economy. But yet their contribution is not being matched by a reform that allow them to play greater roles in world peace and world stability, as it were. On the part of Africa, you remember that we just emerged from the council was formed before we emerged from colonial rule.
Right.
So it's like, as the senior man said, it's like the colonial masters still hold the key if we want to have a say in decisions in the Security Council. So Africa has made a proposal. We want 1 seat to be given to the African Union. There are another seats rotating. Now, but then the 5 permanent members, because of their own geopolitical interests, as it were, are refusing to give voice to those who matter most. Because if you look at the current world, then you want to achieve a more regional balance. You want Africa to be represented, you want the Latin America, you want the Asian, so that in terms of happening within their own region, they will have a better voice in the Security Council to represent themselves. So if the UN is supposed to be the democratic hub of the world, the Security Council as it is now make it so strange that in as much as we push for countries to become more democratic, the only institution we have that will represent humanity, that will ensure peace in the world, is not democratic enough. Even if we insist that there should be a balancing act, so we want to balance power with power, the current structure doesn't reflect that power balance. And since it doesn't reflect that power balance, it will struggle to contain conflict across the world. Because if we take conflict to mean that a power competition of a sort, then you need to have a structure that reflects that power competition. Currently, it doesn't reflect that power competition. It doesn't reflect, even if you talk about the economic might of country, it doesn't reflect it.
Right.
So once not reflecting the realities of today, you expect a lot of change. But as they indicated earlier, because some people are benefiting from the current structure, it's so difficult to reform, because then you need all of them to agree that, well, at this point, we want to agree. If you look at the United States position on Africa, for instance, it's like, okay, we agree that you can have a permanent seat, but without veto. That is like bringing you into the room and allowing you to legitimize whatever they want to do without you even having a real power to have a say. So, for instance, we all know that if Africa had a veto power, the situation that led to the removal of Gaddafi, for instance, will not occur. Now, if you analyze that, you look at the removal of Gaddafi vis-a-vis what is pertaining in Libya and what was there, then you will find out that that decision was not well thought through. But then because of the nature and the structure of that council, it went through. So yes, I think that there should be more pressure on them. The rest of the world might begin to speak with the same voice, might begin to put more pressure on them. It is unlikely they will beg anytime soon, but we can also not relent in our effort to get that council reformed. Right. If it's not reformed anytime soon, it will hold the UN hostage, and major conflict will continue to occur across the world.
And these reforms are not happening, and many are arguing that it's no more United Nations, it's rather United 5 countries or whatever they call it. But what would Africa lose, or African countries or third world countries lose, if they pull out from the United Nations? And then would that, affect the UN's existence in any way?
So it is not a sound advice for third world countries to pull out. As I indicated earlier, in as much as it is an imperfect institution, it's functioning imperfectly, it's still the best hope for the third world countries. What it is that we currently have a number of arrangements among third world countries where they can discuss common challenges and find alternatives and propose to the UN. If they leave that, then they leave the organization to the bigger powers who will then use it to do whatever they want to do. So we have a lot to lose in terms of pulling out, in terms of the role the UN play in settling conflict within our own third world nations. If you talk about peacekeeping, the US is very active in most third world nations that are going through conflict situations. If you look at the role the UN play in terms of helping us address disease situations, of course, those other aspects. Let us not focus so much on the few issues of imperfections, few issues of conflict, and think that the UN is not doing that well. Right. If we look at the many instances of intrastate conflict that the UN has been able to resolve in Africa, in other third world countries, you have to give a lot of credit to them. If you look at their role in trying to spearhead the fight against certain diseases across the third world, Ebola, all of them, they are spearheaded by the UN. Okay. So on those dimensions, the US is doing really, really well. It's only when it comes to conflict that involve major powers that the UN seems not to get it done well.
Okay. All right. Let me go to Emmanuel Bombade. You agree that it will be disastrous and counterproductive for third world countries to, move away from the UN and maybe join other organizations?
No, so I agree that it is not well advised to leave the United Nations. But for me, there is a very important caveat, and I proceed to submit my thinking. Anytime I've being with my good friend, Professor Bafo, in any setting, we always have this interesting conversation that let us start with us in Africa, from country to country, by deepening our democracies and the transparency in governance, and how we rather have become the light and the example of how the world should be governed. That becomes our moral voice to continue to advocate. And the reason this is important for me, and maybe before I even move on, when you are an African country and back at home, your governance systems are themselves repressive. You are changing constitutions to have several mandates, second, third, fourth, fifth term. Your voice in the international arena is weak.
Right.
And you cannot even partner with anybody to advocate and raise any issues. On the same premise, imagine Ghana and Senegal. Because of who we are as modern African democratic states, we don't need to go through the formal structures of the UN. We could have our own bilateral side events, inviting people of similar mind and thinking, and on particular issues, with the support and expertise of professionals, raise very pertinent issues about our interests in the world, in which even when the permanent fight for others do not pay heed, when they go to bed, their conscience does not lead them to sleep soundly. But it is on the premise that we know what we stand on, and that's how we can raise it. So that for me is one. And therefore, I then underscore why it's about creativity. And for those of us who have had the opportunity to work in the UN, there is so much elasticity and flexibility of how you can do things differently. But when you don't have that creativity, or when your professionals or representatives are intimidated or feel timid or have a recourse not to be forthright and forward-going, because of the fear of losing certain privileges, my children's visa will be denied them because I've spoken in a certain way and I want my children to live in the US. If you think like that and orient yourself like that, you are paralyzed. You are not relevant. And so I would conclude on this note by saying, let this mirror from us. And let me be as an example that I can be selfless and I can lose any privileges that an international diplomat would have by continuing to speak truth to power in representing my country.
All right. Thank you so much. Final one on this. Let me bring in Professor Bafo Ajimandua. Your take on whether or not third world countries should pull out. We've seen what the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is trying to do in terms of trade, to do intra-African trade. We've seen ECOWAS and all the regional bodies. They've not been able to achieve that African voice, just as Emmanuel Bombade has said. Should we come back home, look at those structures and build from there?
No, not at all. I think, like my good friends have said, Africa has benefited tremendously from the UN. You take out the Security Council where the problem is and look at the other 18 or so agencies working around the world, World Health Organization, Food, Population, all these organizations, they are on the ground doing fantastic work. So we don't have a problem. But I'm very interested in the point that Emmanuel made about, in my words, saying charity begins at home. And I'm expanding it to the African continent. In fact, if you look at today's dynamics in global politics, the future for Africa is in Africa. Yeah. We have to begin to take seriously what Kwame Nkrumah championed in his time. Because even with the UN, if the big donors, big sponsors, including the United States, and I don't know how long this will last, if they begin to withdraw their subscriptions to the United Nations, most of these programs will be cut down. You see, so I think we need to take seriously how we in Africa can begin to take seriously this idea of coming together. The way we are split is very easy for these so-called world powers to manipulate individual countries to become obstacles in the continental approach to things that we want to do. So I think we need to begin seriously to shape towards what we can do. So I'm coming back to the idea of charity begins at home.
Right.
If African countries can come together through the AU and unite, political unity for sure, but before then, after and all these other things we are setting up, then we can begin to gradually reduce our overdependence on the global economy.
Right.
Because look, I think that's the future. Because these countries out there, they are not charitable organizations. Okay. IMF, World Bank, they are not charitable organizations. They squeeze us, make profit out of us. So I think the idea, the thinking should be towards how continentally Africa can begin to put its acts together so that we can face the world together.
Thank you so much, Professor Bafo Ajimanduya. We've all heard from the three of you. It means that the relevance of the United Nations is still there, except that there are some key challenges, and as Africa, we need to start from home. Well, this week, President John Mahama is scheduled to speak at the 80th UN General Assembly on Thursday, September 25, 2025, delivering Ghana's address to the general debate. I was in New York this past week, and some Ghanaians shared their thoughts and expectations on what they believe the president's address should be focused on. Take a listen to what they said.
It has to do with the constitutional amendments with regards to the appointment of the MCs. Not only that, it's not only the MCs that they should be elected, but the regional ministers also must be elected. And every region should have a regional parliament. What I want the president to say with regards to the checks and balances, that because when Barack Obama came to Ghana, he stood in our parliament and he made it clear that we don't need strong men, but we need strong institutions. The only way the country will move forward is when the institutions are strong. When a person commits a crime, the institution has to deal with it. We should delink human face from our institutions. Other than that, the country will continue to be stagnant. Yeah, I want the president to make a statement by saying that he is going to do more reforms on our institutions, especially the constitutional amendments. The constitution has to be amended. Now, with the issue of Galamsey, as the government know all the hotspots of Galamsey, it is easy for the government to fight Galamsey. When he speaks at the UN, the president has to make it clear that Ghana is not a Galamsey country.
When the president mounts the podium, I want him to first talk about the Galamsey issue in Ghana and the LGBT. Because I remember the LGBT issue. Sam George proposed a bill when Akufo-Addo was in power. But when Mahama resumed power, we've not heard anything about it. He needs to make a stand whether he's for or against the LGBT issue, because it's a big challenge in Ghana. Also, the issue of Galamsey, it's a huge menace in Ghana. People literally don't have quality water. This is a basic amenity every individual needs. What is he doing about it? I remember he said Akufo-Addo should declare a state of emergency during his time. He's in power right now. Is he going to declare a state of emergency? He's not touching about it. He's not talking about it. We know Gold Board is doing great in Ghana. I love Gold Board. Okay, but what is he doing about illegal mining in Ghana? These are the two basic things I think he should talk about, because Ghana is a developing country. People need quality water. People are dying as a result of illegal mining. What is he doing about it?
What I want Mahama to do to fight mostly in Ghana is the Galamsey, and other thing is the discipline of Ghana, because most Ghanaian constitution lacks a lot of discipline.
I would like the president to ponder on the issues of Africa free trade zones, how we, the connected countries, will have access to free markets, access the free markets, not even to talk about globalization. Within our own circle, like West Africa, Togo and all that. And then also, he's arresting a lot of people. I don't think it's necessary. We should focus on the agenda, what he's planned, his good deeds for Ghana. That's what the people want to see.
And so these are the thoughts of Ghanaians living in the United States and their expectation. They want the president to touch on Galamsey issue of constitution review and also LGBTQ. But the big question is, are these the matters the president should be speaking to at the UN? Let me bring in Dr. Hlovo Ishmael. What's your take on these demands by Ghanaians in the United States?
These are citizens, and of course, they have the right to demand certain things of their president. If you look at the issues they want the president to speak on, that's in institutional reforms that make Ghana's democracy stronger, that is justified. You need to demonstrate to the world the steps you are taking to strengthen Ghana's democratic credential, which you have always used in the international forums to woo investors, to woo people to support Ghana. So that is justified. And the issue of Galamsey, perhaps they want the president could link that to the general call for green justice or environmental justice across the world and show what he's doing to tackle this issue, and also maybe court international support in terms of addressing it. Of course, we know that foreigners are involved, so that may also be a forum to try and get those foreign leaders whose citizens are part here to hear him and realize that the activities of their citizens is not in the best interest of Ghana. So yes, as citizens who are watching their leader, they are right to demand some of those, and the president can find a way to put those issues, win some level of support for Ghana in those regards. Okay. But there are other issues that the president will have to talk to. For instance, if you come to LGBTQ+, personally, I don't think that we need to go out there and take a definite stance. Currently, I think our strategy has been to be strategically ambiguous, where in one, the current law doesn't permit it, but we want to strengthen that law. You may decide to ignore it. It doesn't really take anything away from you. You are just being ambiguous while you realize that domestically there are strong institutions here who can take care of LGBTQ+. Because these are issues. But
to cut you respectfully, the president was clear when he was campaigning to win the power. And so why should he remain silent at this point?
Well, I say that's a strategy he may choose. You can, in terms of political campaigning, that is one thing. And in terms of representing a nation where you have to sell that nation to various groups, including even those of that community, you have to find a way around it. I'm not against passing a legislation that explicitly ban LGBTQ+ people in Ghana. But if you think that may not be to the interest that you want to promote Ghana as a welcoming nation to all manner of people, then you may well decide not to say anything about it, and that's also fine.
Right. So from where you sit as an international relations expert yourself, the president will be mounting the platform, giving the podium to speak. What are the three key things you want the president to touch on when he speaks?
So the first one is that I want him to appeal, as he tries to address the issue of global conflicts and their impact on Africa, for that matter, Ghana. Given the era of geopolitical struggle, I also want him to call for more support for African countries in terms of addressing issues of terrorism, in terms of strengthening African security. The kind of geopolitical environment we have now is that attention has shifted virtually to Israel, to Ukraine, and all those things. So, but then there are conflict situations, particularly in African countries who are struggling with terrorism, that still need support. So the UN must still be reminded that in as much as those places are geopolitical hotspots that are shifting their attention, there are places in Africa where they need to strengthen security institutions to deal with issues of terrorism and so forth and so on. And also globally, of course, we have seen securitization of migration, where migrants are being treated as if they are people without any right. He may want to also venture into that and appeal for a more humane migration regime that allow people to move freely and conduct their business. Of course, the third one is that, particularly to Africa, he must then sell Africa as the next destination of businesses, the next place of growth, the place where the next revolution in terms of growth was coming from. Right. He must find a way to sell Africa and, for that matter, Ghana.
Okay, thank you so much. Let me bring in Emmanuel Bombardier. And first of all, your thoughts on what the demands Ghanaians in the U.S. are making, Galamsey, LGBTQ, constitutional review, and all of that. What do you make of those demands and the three top things you think the president should be focusing on when he mounts the podium?
So first of all, in response to what the Ghanaian people are saying on the streets of New York, the president has to be, well, I agree that he might not have that space to bring in all the domestic issues. Right. But under Galamsey, the president needs to restate our commitment to a clean environment. And a clean environment means dealing effectively with the menace of Galamsey. Now, here is the argument. There is one thought that even if today a state of emergency were declared, it does not necessarily mean Galamsey disappears if you don't confront it frontally. Now, what we are seeing is a more robust response. Would that be effective in ending Galamsey without necessarily declaring a state of emergency? And I think the next 4 weeks will determine how we are able to assess that. But for me, it doesn't matter whether you are declaring a state of emergency or not. You want to confront this issue as if our lives was on it. And I agree with Ishmael. Kolebu is reporting an upsurge in kidney diseases up to 2,000 in the first half of the year. Yeah. I believe we are drinking poisonous water, and that is killing us. So there is no debate about that. Now, on LGBT, the president has not been silent. What the president has said is that rather than allowing the continuation of a private member's bill, let it be state-sponsored in parliament. Now, for those who think that there is a delay, that's another debate in terms of how do we ensure we go forward. But at the end of the day, I think I like the way Ishmael framed it. Our cultural aspirations and traditions and where we see ourselves in this world is what defines how we are tolerant or not of this confusion that we call LGBT. And to that extent, therefore, whatever we do must reflect who we are as a people, from the south to the north and from the east to the west. Yeah, then I don't know whether there was something still domestic, but very quickly, if I were to name three things, one would be for the president to advocate very strongly for what we have just been discussing, UN reforms, and those reforms taking into account Africa's interests. Ishmael mentioned how we are responding to international peace issues, security, in which up to 70% of the issues are on our continent. We must have the support to lead and have the ownership of how we are responding to conflict. If I had time, one of my last assignments was supporting the government of Angola in their mediation between Rwanda and the DRC. To put it very short, all of a sudden we woke up one morning and heard that these two parties had appeared in Washington, and that was going to be given a privileged position from the African Union led. And keep in mind, the president of Angola was a champion, or is still the champion of peace and stability in Africa. He's currently the chair of the African Union. So he decided to step down. This I saw on the background pictures you are rolling. I saw the president of Angola, somebody I respect so much. Now, what has happened? It was announced in Washington that there's a ceasefire, the conflict has ended. Yesterday, the upsurge in violence has recurred with the DRC bombarding positions of the M23. By this, I mean Africa's response to conflicts must be led by Africa. If anybody thought they could take the issues out of Africa and resolve it, people should think again. Right. And one way to do that is to deal with countries that are supporting the proxy wars of Africa. How is it possible for the rapid support forces to have access to drones and attacking mosques that is killing more than 100 people at a time? So that for me will be one. And if I were to quickly end, I would then say he could push and assure the international community that we are embarking on governance reforms to deepen and strengthen our democracy. So that when we are talking about peace and stability, we mean it. We are the only country that do not elect our local councillors or assembly men and women and our DCEs. Malawi just ended an election. On the ballot were three: your local councillor, your member of parliament, your president? Why have we delayed so long from having elected our representatives at local governance level? And I think I'll leave it here because I've already taken some of the time.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it. And let me bring in Professor Bafo Ajimandia. Ghanaians are asking the president to touch on Galamsey at the UN, LGBT and constitution review issues. What's your take on what those demands are? And yourself, 3 top things you think the president can touch on when he mounts the podium.
Well, Carlos, in the good old days, in the 60s and early 70s, when African leaders went to the General Assembly, the issues they were dealing with were critical international issues that affect Africa directly. In the 60s, when decolonization was still in progress, you get Nkrumah going there and challenging the world on the need for freedom for those colonized areas, on and on. Nobody went to the United Nations to give account of their internal problems. But somehow, over the years, I hear my presidents going there and telling the United Nations how many schools on the trees they have converted. Okay? How many schools we have built? How many hospitals we built? In my humble opinion, those are completely unnecessary.
Right.
The General Assembly is a global forum where some of the issues raised by my colleagues on the panel tonight, that is why you deal with those things. Try seeking the support of the global community for issues that are critical for the advancement of your country and Africa generally, since we are talking about Africa. So these issues of course, it's all right to tell the world you are deepening your democracy, you are doing fine. But I think the focus should be on how the challenges of globalization is affecting African countries or Ghana, and therefore the need for the global community through the United Nations to seek some kind of redress. Of course, reforming the UN will be one thing that will help in that. So I think that should be the focus. So personally, I get a little bit disturbed when I see my president going to the UN and telling the world, I've removed schools under trees, 100 of them. I have done what? Those kind of mundane things. Whenever I hear that, I kind of feel a little bit embarrassed. So I think let our president focus on the issues that my colleagues have already stated. I don't need to repeat them.
Right.
Okay? So I think that should be the focus. As for the expression of our fellow citizens on the streets of New York, fine, they are citizens. These are their concerns. And I think every Ghanaian has a right to express their concern for the president to carry. But if I'm the president, I think I'm going to focus on the bigger issues. Look, calling on African nations to come together to be able to present a united front in dealing with global issues so that the United Nations can begin to recognize Africa as having this voice for a change.
Right. Thank you so much, Prof, for speaking to us here. I believe you'll be watching proceedings when, of course, our president mounts the podium. And but let me give the final word to Emmanuel Bombardier quickly. You have an intervention to make. Yeah.
Yeah, I was not sure. I have less than a minute. I was not sure I would have the opportunity. On this special day of International Peace Day, which is also our founders' birthday in terms of the celebration, if our president could have a short paragraph for us to express international solidarity with the people of Palestine on their right to own their own land and govern themselves, which is also a human right, and which will be in the long-term interest of solving the Middle East crisis. I bring this in for a very simple reason. We in Africa, and particularly Ghana, we saw this long ago, and we advocated and supported a two-state solution. It's interesting that it is now that many countries, particularly in Europe, are joining us. And it is never too late, but it is high time that the world stands united, that the most vulnerable people on this earth also have a place on this earth to call their home. And I totally appreciate so much the comments from my two co-panelists.
Thank you.
And I support you 100% on the Palestinian issue. I think the president should put that across.
Yes.
I like that.
Right. Dr. Hlovo, your final words, 30 seconds.
Thank you. I think that the UN is still a very useful institution. African countries must begin to rally themselves around, make a lot of reforms within the African Union and solve most of the problem and carry their common front into the UN. That will help Africa to push for the reforms that we are all looking for. I thank you for the discussion and thank my senior colleagues for the insightful discussion.
Thank you. Wow.
Thank you, gentlemen. We so much appreciate your time. Professor Bafwa Jimandia, Emmanuel Bombade, as well as Dr. Ishmael Hlovo for joining us here on The Probe. You've been listening to us on Joy 99.7 FM, also watching us on JoyNews channel 421. And hopefully next week, we're going to have another exciting episode here on The Probe. My name, as always, is Carlos Kaloni. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye.